My father has only one dream: to see me married to a dragon. He's the Minister for Relations with the Dragon Kingdoms, and he seems to have forgotten that his daughter is not a diplomatic gift. I have a dream of my own: to build the best event planning agency in the kingdom. So we made a wager. If I successfully organize the spring ball at the all-male Dragon Academy, he'll stop trying to arrange my marriage once and for all. The terms are simple. Pulling it off is anything but. My father finds me a rival himself. After all, our wager never said he couldn't put obstacles in my way for the sake of what he calls my brighter future. And then the Academy assigns Daren as my supervisor, the dean, a charmingly arrogant rogue, and my childhood nemesis. He's only 7 years older than I am, yet he already runs an entire faculty of dragons. Every encounter between us begins with a cutting remark. Somehow, it always ends with my cheeks burning while he looks at me as though he knows something about me that even I don't. My reputation is at stake. So is my freedom. But I refuse to back down. Chapter 1. Lira stormed into her father's study that morning with all the grace of an enraged cat, waving an invitation to yet another coincidentally arranged reception where, judging by the guest list, someone was once again planning to put a promising dragon bachelor in her path. "This is the 7th one this month," she declared, tossing the parchment onto the desk in front of the minister, who sat behind a mountain of official documents with the expression of a man long accustomed to such morning visits from his daughter. "The 7th, father," I counted. "Young Caius is an excellent match," Minister Valdorf replied, without even looking up from his papers, as though discussing her love life were no more important than commenting on the weather. "Heir to the Northern clan, descended from a rare fire bloodline, impeccable manners." "I don't care about his manners or his bloodline, father. I care about my own future, not the one you insist on forcing upon me." At last, he looked up, and Lira saw in his eyes the same stubborn determination that had accompanied every conversation like this for the past 2 years, ever since she had officially reached what her father considered a suitable age for marriage. "Your future, my dear, lies in making a respectable match, one that will strengthen our family's position," he said in a tone that allowed little room for argument, though after all these years, Lira had learned to recognize that beneath his unyielding manner lay less cold calculation than one very stubborn dream. A dragon king at court, a son-in-law from a ruling bloodline. That is an honor few fathers are in a position to secure for their daughters. "My future lies in running my own event planning agency," she shot back, folding her arms across her chest. "Organizing balls, receptions, celebrations people will remember for years. Not becoming someone's wife because you decided the marriage would be politically convenient." "An event planning agency," the minister repeated with the same condescending smile that never failed to make Lira want to prove him wrong at any cost. "A charming hobby for a young lady, perhaps, but hardly a suitable occupation for a minister's daughter." "It isn't a hobby, father. It's my calling." He set down his quill and finally gave her his full attention. Lira recognized the gesture immediately. It meant an argument was coming, one that could easily drag on for an hour unless she found a way to turn the situation in her favor now. "Fine," she said suddenly, giving voice to an idea that had been growing inside her for weeks. "Then let's prove which of our dreams deserves to come true. A wager, father." The minister's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise, a rare sight from a man accustomed to controlling the course of every conversation with unwavering confidence. "What kind of wager?" "The spring ball," Lira said, feeling the idea take shape even as she spoke, becoming more concrete and more daring with every word. "The biggest event of the season at the all-male Dragon Academy, where the children of the kingdom's most influential families study. If I organize it flawlessly, you give up on trying to marry me off to a dragon. Forever. And if you fail? He asked, narrowing his eyes with the calculating expression that told her the proposed bargain had caught his interest. Then I'll accept the next candidate you choose without a single objection, she replied, though the thought of such an outcome made everything inside her tighten. Her confidence in her own abilities outweighed whatever caution better judgment might have demanded. But I won't lose, Father. I'll organize the finest ball that Academy has ever seen. Chapter 9. Minister Valdorf remained silent for a long moment, studying his daughter with an expression that blended a father's pride in her determination with the strategic calculation of a man accustomed to thinking several moves ahead. The Dragon Academy, he repeated slowly, as though testing the idea for himself. An institution where ordinary event planners are not permitted without special authorization from the Council of Deans. Then you'll help me obtain that authorization, Lira said firmly. If I'm going to face this challenge, Father, it would hardly be fair to deny me the basic opportunity to attempt it. The corner of his mouth twitched in a barely perceptible smile, hidden beneath his carefully maintained stern expression. I did not propose this wager, my daughter. You did. Then stop hiding behind technicalities and give me a chance, she countered with the same boldness that never failed to irritate her father and, though he would never admit it, make him secretly proud of her. He rose from behind his desk and walked to the window, which overlooked the spires of the capital, the familiar towers of the royal palace standing prominently among them. The terms of the wager must be clear, he said at last, without turning around. The ball must be flawless, not a single complaint from the Council of Deans or from the royal family, who will attend the celebration as honored guests. No allowances will be made for the organizer's youth or lack of experience. Agreed, Lira said without hesitation. And I reserve the right to take any actions that might contribute to my own victory in this wager, he added, still gazing out the window, since our terms do not state otherwise. Lira frowned at the wording. There was something suspicious about the excessive care with which her father had phrased it, but the thrill of imagining her approaching victory overwhelmed her caution. As you wish, Father. I have nothing to hide in my preparations, which means I have nothing to fear. She had no idea then just how naive those words would prove in light of what was to come. But at that moment, as she left her father's study with the triumphant satisfaction of having struck the bargain, Lira saw only one clear goal ahead of her: to prove to her father, to the entire kingdom, and above all to herself, that her dream deserved to become reality, every bit as much as any political ambition woven into the fate of an influential minister's daughter. Once Minister Valdorf was alone, he allowed himself a broad smile as soon as the door closed behind her. The Dragon Academy, if his daughter was so determined to prove herself there, surrounded by some of the kingdom's most eligible bachelors, it would be almost criminal not to take advantage of the opportunity. He pulled a list of recent Academy graduates from a shelf and began searching for suitable candidates for a plan of his own. All he needed was someone capable of accomplishing through daily proximity what all his previous matchmaking attempts had failed to achieve. He found the name sooner than expected. Daren, Dean of the Faculty of Dragons, the youngest man ever to hold the position in the Academy's history. His reputation was impeccable, and his lineage noble enough to satisfy even the most ambitious prospective father-in-law. Chapter 2. The Dragon Academy greeted Lira with massive gates of dark stone, crowned with carved figures of winged guardians, whose stone eyes seemed to follow every visitor, silently judging whether they were worthy to enter. She arrived in the morning, 2 days after making the wager with her father, armed with his letter of recommendation and a folder containing the first sketches and plans for the upcoming celebration. The academy courtyard was breathtaking in scale. Training grounds designed for dragon transformations stretched almost as far as the eye could see, while the magnificent main building, constructed in the shape of outstretched wings, towered over the entire complex with the same proud bearing that, according to rumor, characterized every graduate of this prestigious institution. "You must be Minister Valdorf's daughter," a voice said behind her. Lira had stopped in the middle of the courtyard to study the architecture with the professional eye of an event planner, already imagining where future decorations might go. She turned and froze for a moment. Recognition hit her before she had time to summon even one of the witty remarks she normally kept ready for situations like this. "Daren," she said at last, hiding the sudden quickening of her heartbeat behind an even tone and blaming it entirely on the surprise of seeing him. "I didn't expect you to be the one I'd find here." He had changed in the years since they had last seen each other. He had matured, grown taller, and his features had acquired the sharp definition that separated the man standing before her from the young man she remembered. Dark hair, slightly longer than strict academy standards probably allowed, framed a face with high cheekbones and eyes the color of molten gold, a mark of dragon blood inherited from his mother. "Dean of the Faculty of Dragons, at your service," he said, giving her a theatrical bow filled with the same irreverent humor that had accompanied every one of their childhood encounters at family receptions. "Though I have to admit, the service you're about to demand of me sounds suspiciously ambitious, judging by the rumors already making their way through the Council of Deans." "Rumors spread faster than wildfire around here, I see," Lira remarked, arching an eyebrow. "An all-male academy enjoys gossip just as much as any fashionable salon," he replied with a smirk, "especially when the subject is a minister's daughter who made a public wager with her own father for the right to organize a ball inside an institution where women normally aren't allowed without special permission." "So you already know the terms," she said, folding her arms across her chest, a defensive gesture she had used since childhood to project confidence even when entirely different emotions were raging inside her. "The entire council knows," Daren confirmed, stepping closer with the effortless grace that seemed to come naturally to dragons, even in human form. "And I've been given the questionable honor of supervising your little venture on behalf of the academy, since the dean responsible for ceremonial events had the misfortune of coming down with dragon fever at the worst possible time." Lira felt a familiar irritation rising inside her, the same one he had inspired since childhood, mixed with something far less familiar that she had absolutely no intention of examining too closely right now. "So you're going to be my reluctant babysitter for the next few weeks," she said, slipping easily into the sharp banter that had defined their relationship since they were children. "How fortunate that fate has brought us together again, Daren." "Fortunate for you, you mean?" he shot back, his eyes gleaming with playful challenge. "Not every event planner gets the privilege of working under the supervision of the youngest dean in the academy's history. Modesty clearly isn't among your virtues. And sarcasm, I see, is still your defining trait," he replied without missing a beat. "Good to know the years haven't changed the most important thing about you, Lira." Something about the way he said her name made her heart skip a beat. Not her full name, as etiquette would have demanded after so many years apart, but the shorter, almost intimate version he had used when they were children. She immediately blamed the reaction on irritation at his insufferable confidence. "Just show me the main hall where the ball is supposed to take place," she said, more sharply than she intended, eager to move the conversation onto safer, professional ground. "I don't have enough time to waste it trading pleasantries with a dean who clearly enjoys his own wit far more than a grown man in his position should." "As you command, your event planning highness," he said with another mocking bow. But he turned and led the way across the courtyard toward the main building with the casual confidence of someone who knew every corridor within these walls. They walked side by side in silence for several minutes. Lira studied the academy's architecture with a professional eye, considering possible decorations, table arrangements, and the best use of the available space. Daren, meanwhile, watched her focused expression from the corner of his eye with a look she never would have noticed if she hadn't happened to turn at exactly the wrong moment. "What?" she asked, catching him staring. "Nothing," he replied too quickly, looking away with a haste completely unlike him. "I was just remembering what you were like at 12, when you told my father that dragons were overrated as husbands, and that the only men worth paying attention to were those capable of holding an intelligent conversation for more than 5 minutes. Heat rushed into Lira's cheeks at the memory, one she had long since buried among countless other childhood embarrassments. "I was a child," she said quickly. "Children say foolish things." "Some foolish things turn out to be surprisingly prophetic," Daren said quietly. There was something in his voice she couldn't quite identify, even if she had wanted to. She was far too busy trying to conceal her own confusion behind her familiar mask of ironic confidence. They reached the main hall, a vast chamber with soaring vaulted ceilings that, in Lira's professional opinion, was perfectly suited for a grand ball. For a moment, she allowed herself to forget her embarrassment and lose herself in calculations of space, lighting, decorations, and possible seating arrangements. The question of what Daren had meant by his last remark remained hanging between them, unanswered but not forgotten, waiting to return to her in the quiet hours of the evening, with a persistence she intended to ignore for as long as possible. Chapter 3. The first working week passed in a whirlwind of preparations, supplier lists, menu planning with the Academy chefs, who were accustomed to cooking exclusively for dragon appetites, and their particular preferences for roasted meats and rare spices, and discussions with the Academy Orchestra, which had never before performed for a mixed gathering of the kingdom's noble families. Daren attended most of those meetings as the Academy's official supervisor, which, by Lira's calculations, meant spending far more time in his company than she cared to admit aloud. "Are you sure about the placement of the head table?" he asked one evening, leaning over her sketches of the ballroom in the office she had been given for the duration of the preparations. Dragons prefer plenty of space around them while they eat, an instinct inherited from ancestors who once flew freely among the clouds. "I've already accounted for that," Lira replied without looking up from her drawings, although she was acutely aware of how close he was standing behind her in the confines of the small office. "I increased the distance between the tables by a third compared with standard banquet etiquette for exactly that reason." "Impressive," he said, and the genuine respect in his voice caught her off guard, as it always did whenever it slipped through his usual mask of teasing amusement. "You really did prepare for this project. This wasn't just some desperate wager with your father that you came up with on a whim." "I've been preparing for this for years, Daren," she said, finally turning to face him. "I was simply waiting for the right opportunity, something that would force my father to take my dreams seriously." He studied her for a long moment, and in that silence, for the first time in years, Lira felt as though someone truly saw her. Not as the daughter of an influential minister, not as a potential bride for yet another dragon, but simply as herself, with all the ambition and talent she had spent so long trying to prove to everyone around her. "I believe you," he said quietly. Those simple words, spoken without even a trace of his usual irony, caught her more off guard than his sharpest teasing ever could. "Thank you," she replied, suddenly uncomfortable with the sincerity of the moment. Their relationship had always been built on banter and mutual provocation. This was unfamiliar territory. The silence between them lasted longer than was entirely appropriate for a professional meeting. Then Daren stepped closer. The distance between them narrowed until Lira could feel the warmth radiating from him, as though his dragon nature revealed itself even in human form through the faint heat surrounding his body. "You've changed," he said, studying her face with an intensity that made her heart beat faster for no apparent reason. "Everyone changes," she replied, trying to sound casual, though her voice betrayed her with the slightest tremor. "Not the way you have." His hand rose, almost of its own accord, as though acting independently of conscious thought, and he gently brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face. The touch was light, barely there, and yet Lira felt it like lightning racing through her entire body, from the tips of his fingers to somewhere deep inside her. She instinctively stepped back, her cheeks flushing with a treacherous heat she tried, and failed, to conceal behind the sharpness of her tone. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Daren?" she demanded, reaching instinctively for the sarcasm that had protected her since childhood, though her voice sounded far less confident than she would have liked. He didn't retreat, despite the sharpness of her words. He simply watched her confusion with the unmistakable satisfaction of a man who had finally managed to provoke the reaction he had been looking for. "I was only moving your hair out of your face," he said innocently, though the amusement flickering in his golden eyes suggested motives far more complicated than concern for her appearance. "You turned remarkably red for someone who merely had her hair touched, Lira. I wonder why that is." "No reason at all," she replied far too quickly, retreating to a safer distance and pretending to study her sketches with renewed concentration. "It's simply too warm in here." "Of course," he agreed with a smirk that made it perfectly clear he didn't believe a single word of her excuse. Still, he was tactful enough, or perhaps simply too pleased with what he had discovered, to spare her any further questions. The rest of their evening meeting unfolded in an atmosphere far more charged than usual. Lira carefully avoided getting physically close to him and responded to every remark with twice her usual sharpness, compensating for her own confusion with exaggerated professionalism. Daren, for his part, seemed quietly entertained by her obvious attempts to restore the familiar distance between them, finding a private satisfaction in her embarrassment that he carefully concealed behind a mask of professional restraint. As Lira left the academy that evening, she caught herself thinking that, for the first time in all the years she had known him, what she felt toward her former childhood rival was no longer limited to competition and irritation. There was something else now, something far more unsettling, and at the same time, strangely thrilling. Something that demanded closer examination, though she wasn't ready to give it any. For now, she preferred to blame her racing heart on the pressure of organizing the most important event of her life, rather than acknowledge the real reason it seemed to beat faster whenever the dean of the Faculty of Dragons was near. Chapter 4. Minister Valdorf arrived at the academy 3 days later. Officially, he was there to support his daughter in her ambitious undertaking. Unofficially, he had a far more practical purpose, one he carefully concealed behind the mask of paternal concern. "I've brought you an assistant," he announced the moment he entered Lira's office, just as she looked up from yet another list of suppliers for the floral arrangements. "A young academy instructor who, according to what I've heard, possesses remarkable organizational talent." Behind him stood a woman whose exact age was difficult to determine. Her features still held a youthful freshness, but her eyes carried the unmistakable mark of years spent teaching. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe bun that emphasized her refined, if somewhat sharp, features, while her posture revealed the military discipline common among many of dragon blood. "Kasha," she introduced herself, dipping into an elegant curtsy that was nevertheless noticeably lacking in genuine warmth. "I teach aerial combat tactics at the Faculty of Dragons. Your father believes my experience organizing academy events may prove useful in your preparations for the ball." Lira studied the newcomer with a professional eye, noticing a certain tension in her smile, but initially dismissing it as the natural awkwardness of a first meeting. "I'll be grateful for any help," Lira said, extending her hand in greeting. "Organizing an event of this scale requires far more hands than I originally anticipated." "Which is precisely why I insisted on bringing Kasha in," Minister Valdorf interjected, looking extremely pleased with his own foresight. I would hate to see my daughter fail this challenge simply because she lacked enough capable people to lighten the workload. Something about her father's excessive insistence made Lira wary, though she couldn't put her distrust into words. It was little more than instinct, too vague to justify an outright objection. "Thank you for your concern, Father," she said carefully. "Although I would have preferred to choose my own team for a project this important." "Indulge me in this one small thing, my dear," the minister replied, with the disarming smile that had been weakening her objection since childhood. "Consider it your father's contribution to your success, since there is little else I can do to help you with this wager." Reluctantly, Lira agreed. She had no idea what truly lay behind her father's seemingly thoughtful gesture. The day before his visit, Minister Valdorf had secretly reached an agreement with her new assistant. Kasia was to introduce small, almost imperceptible mistakes into the preparations. Nothing disastrous, nothing obvious enough to expose direct interference, but enough to create difficulties that might gradually tip the wager in her father's favor. What Minister Valdorf did not realize, however, was that Kasia had motives of her own, and they ran far deeper than his. For years, Kasia had harbored an unrequited love for Dean Daren, along with a quiet, carefully concealed resentment toward any woman whose name became even remotely associated with his heart in academy gossip. To Kasia, the minister's proposal had sounded like a rare gift from fate itself, an opportunity to remove a potential rival under the perfectly respectable guise of professional assistance. "I've prepared several proposals for decorating the main hall," Kasia said, taking a collection of sketches from her folder. They were executed with enough skill and professionalism to satisfy even the most critical eye. They're based on the traditions of academy celebrations from the past several decades. "Impressive," Lira admitted, studying the drawings with genuine interest and not the slightest suspicion of their creator's true intentions. "Though I think some elements should be adapted to suit the more modern tastes of the guests attending the ball." "Of course," Kasia agreed readily, hiding the irritation simmering beneath her calm exterior at having to work under the direction of a woman whose very presence near Daren felt like a personal insult. Daren appeared in the office an hour later and found the two women deep in an animated discussion about the details of the upcoming celebration. Lira noticed the change in Kasia's expression the moment he entered. Her professional concentration gave way to something more personal, something an attentive observer could hardly have missed. "Kasia," Daren said, greeting his colleague with the same polite detachment he showed most members of the academy faculty. "I didn't know you'd been brought onto the ball preparations." "Minister Valdorf thought my experience might be useful," she replied. There was something in her voice that Lira failed to interpret correctly at the time. A mixture of professional pride and something far more personal, carefully hidden beneath a thin layer of academic restraint. "Well, it seems we have a proper team now," Daren remarked, turning his attention to Lira with the same easy smile that never failed to make her heart beat faster, despite all her efforts to remain outwardly composed. "I imagine things will move much faster with another pair of capable hands." Lira nodded. She had no idea how wrong that assumption would prove over the coming weeks. Small problems would begin to appear, minor at first, each one easy enough to dismiss as an unfortunate coincidence, but they would grow steadily more frequent and more serious until the truth finally emerged in all its ugliness, forcing Lira to reconsider not only her plans for the upcoming ball, but also what it truly meant to trust the people she had sincerely believed were helping her achieve her dream. Chapter 5. The first strange incident occurred 2 days later. The order for floral arrangements, which Lira had carefully coordinated with a local florist, arrived completely wrong. Instead of spring tulips and daffodils, the Academy received boxes of wilting autumn chrysanthemums that matched neither the color scheme nor the mood of the upcoming celebration. "What a strange mistake," Kasia remarked, examining the delivery with carefully performed confusion. Perhaps the florist mixed up your order with one intended for another event. Perhaps, Lira agreed, though the first hint of unease had already begun to form at the edge of her mind, still too faint to become outright suspicion. We'll have to place another order and lose several more days waiting for the correct flowers to arrive. The next problem surfaced a week later. The guest list had been meticulously checked before being sent to the printer for the invitations. Yet when they came back, several of the kingdom's most influential family names contained embarrassing errors, including, most unfortunately, the surname of the Academy's own rector. How could this have happened? Lira demanded, staring at the disastrous invitations with growing frustration. I personally checked every single name before sending the list. Printers make mistakes when dealing with large orders, Cassia suggested, with the same flawless composure that accompanied every explanation she offered for each new setback. Perhaps we should find someone more reliable for the second printing. Lira nodded, dismissing the incident as simple bad luck, though the number of such accidents over the past 2 weeks was beginning to feel far too high to be mere coincidence. The third problem emerged while they were testing the decorations in the main hall. The draperies Lira had ordered arrived in a completely unsuitable shade of blue, clashing horribly with the carefully planned color palette of soft pastels inspired by early spring. I specifically ordered pale lavender, Lira said, staring at the heavy, dark blue fabric with mounting irritation. Not this gloomy shade that would be better suited to a funeral than a spring ball. Fabric suppliers are notoriously careless with details like that, Cassia remarked evenly, without the slightest trace of guilt over her own role in the substitution, arranged through secret correspondence with an unscrupulous merchant who had been more than willing to accept a bribe for the favor. Daren, who was present for this latest disaster, examined the ruined fabric with a thoughtful expression that Lira didn't immediately recognize as a sign that his own suspicions were beginning to grow. There's a strange pattern developing here, he said quietly, drawing Lira aside under the pretense of discussing alternative decorations. Far too many mistakes for a project being managed by someone as obviously capable as you. What are you suggesting? Lira asked cautiously, though part of her mind had already begun forming similar suspicions. Perhaps nothing, he replied, although his expression suggested otherwise. Just the instincts of a dean who's learned to notice patterns where everyone else sees random coincidences. You suspect Kasha, Lira said directly, finally voicing the thought she had been avoiding for the past several days. I'm not prepared to make accusations without sufficient evidence, Daren answered carefully. But I would advise you to pay closer attention to the details of her work from now on, Lira. Just in case. She nodded, feeling that familiar warmth spread through her at the concern in his voice, entirely free of his usual teasing. She immediately told herself it was nothing more than gratitude for a friend's advice, not anything deeper that might require uncomfortable examination. Thank you for warning me, she said, taking a step back to restore the familiar distance between them. A distance that had become far more fragile over the past few weeks than she cared to admit. Any time, he replied with a faint smile. Though I have to admit, it isn't only the success of your project I care about, Lira. His expression grew more serious. Your well-being matters to me far more than it should if this were merely a dean taking a professional interest in the success of an event planner working at his academy. The words hung between them, carrying a meaning they both seemed to understand, yet neither was ready to discuss openly. And when Lira left the academy that evening, with a growing list of suspicions about her new assistant's true role in the string of unfortunate setbacks, she carried Daren's confession with her as well. It echoed through her thoughts far more loudly than she was willing to admit, even to herself. Chapter 6. Lira's evening meetings with Daren had become something more than a simple professional necessity. She caught herself looking forward to them, though she carefully concealed that anticipation behind a mask of professional focus on the upcoming celebration. That evening was unusually warm for early spring, so they decided to discuss the final details of the table arrangements not in the cramped office, but out on the open terrace adjoining the main hall. From there, they could see the Academy's training grounds fading into the soft shadows of twilight. "You're unusually quiet tonight," Daren observed, watching her over the sketches spread across the table. "Normally by this hour, you've managed to insult me at least twice for making a bad joke." "I'm simply tired of calculating dragon appetites for the menu," she replied with feigned seriousness, though the true reason for her distraction went far deeper than simple exhaustion. Apparently, determining an average serving size for someone of a fire bloodline is more complicated than I originally expected. "I could offer some personal experience," he suggested with a smirk, leaning back in the carved stone chair that had stood on the terrace for as long as anyone could remember. "Though I'm afraid my own portions are considerably larger than whatever average your cooks have calculated." "Hardly surprising, considering the size of your ego," she shot back, feeling the familiar ease of their banter gradually restore her balance. He laughed, and the sound, genuine and free of his usual teasing edge, made her heart flutter in a way she wasn't used to. She quickly lowered her gaze to the sketches, trying to hide her reaction behind the serious expression of someone completely absorbed in professional calculations. "Do you remember when we both got stuck in that tree in your father's garden?" he asked suddenly, changing the subject. "We were teenagers. You were stranded on the highest branch, and I climbed up to rescue you." "I remember you nearly falling yourself while trying to play the hero," she said, smiling despite herself at the memory. "And for the record, I was doing perfectly well on my own until you turned a simple rescue into an entire performance for our parents." "I was trying to impress someone," he admitted quietly. There was an unexpected sincerity in the confession, stripped of his usual defensive humor. "Who exactly?" Lira asked, looking up from the sketches, intrigued by the unfamiliar note in his voice. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply studied her face in the soft evening light with the same expression she had noticed before, a mixture of tenderness and caution, as though he were standing on the edge of a confession he wasn't quite ready to make. "Perhaps you," he said at last. Rising from his chair and moving closer, Lira felt the air between them grow heavier, charged with the same tension she had experienced during their previous meeting in the office, when he had unexpectedly brushed the hair away from her face. "Daren," she began, uncertain whether she wanted to stop what was happening or encourage it. "We work together. This is inappropriate." "A great many things about us are inappropriate if you insist on looking at them strictly," he replied, stopping so close that she could feel the warmth of his body despite the small distance still separating them. "A minister's daughter and an academy dean trading the same childish insults years after we were last truly close." "We were never truly close," she objected, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Weren't we?" he asked softly. He raised one hand and gently touched her chin, guiding her gaze up to meet his golden eyes. "Then what would you call what's happening between us right now, Lira?" She froze. Her heart seemed to be pounding somewhere in her throat, and for once, every sharp remark she normally used to protect herself from moments of vulnerability had completely abandoned her. "I don't know," she whispered honestly, stripped for once of her usual shield of wit. "Then let me show you." He leaned closer. Before she could object or step away, his lips met hers. The kiss began softly, almost like a question, as though he were giving her one last chance to pull away if she wanted to. But despite everything she had said about how inappropriate this was, Lira found herself kissing him back, with the same unexpected intensity that had been building between them through weeks of unspoken attraction. His hands settled around her waist, drawing her closer, and she abandoned every sensible argument in her mind, rising onto her toes and leaning into him until the last space between them disappeared. The kiss deepened, carrying years of feelings held so tightly beneath the surface that Lira herself hadn't known they existed until this very moment, when all she could think about was the warmth of his touch and the overwhelming realization that she didn't want to pull away. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Lira realized her cheeks were burning more fiercely than ever. When she tried to speak, her voice sounded far less certain than she wanted it to. "That wasn't supposed to happen," she said, though the words sounded unconvincing even to her. "But it did," Daren replied with a quiet smile, taking obvious pleasure in her embarrassment. "And judging by that blush, you're not nearly as opposed to what happened as you're trying to convince me." "Don't you dare look so pleased with yourself, Daren," she said, attempting to recover her usual sharpness, though the heat in her cheeks only intensified under his amused gaze. "You're adorable when you're embarrassed," he said softly, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her flushed face with the same gentle gesture he had used during their previous meeting. "I should have realized that when we were younger, instead of waiting until now to discover it." She stepped back, trying to regain her composure, though inside, the emotions awakened by that unexpected and, as she was finally willing to admit to herself, long-awaited kiss were still raging. "We need to get back to work," she said, gathering the scattered sketches with an uncharacteristic haste. "As you wish," he agreed with the same cheerful compliance that made his satisfaction with the change between them painfully obvious. "Though I suspect we have much more to discuss now than table arrangements and menus for dragon appetites, Lira." She had no answer. Whatever remained of her confidence that she was immune to his charm had finally crumbled, leaving her alone with the realization of feelings that were becoming harder to deny with every new moment she spent in his company. Chapter 7. 3 days had passed since the kiss on the terrace, 3 days in which Lira still hadn't found the courage to talk to Daren about what had happened between them. Instead, she threw herself into the preparations with twice her usual determination, as though keeping busy could somehow protect her from having to confront her own feelings. Their meetings hadn't become any less frequent, but something between them had undeniably changed. Daren now allowed himself small touches that would once have been unthinkable. A hand resting at the small of her back as he guided her through a crowded academy corridor. Fingers lingering against her palm a little longer than necessary when passing her documents. And amused, knowing glances whenever she made yet another awkward attempt to maintain a professional distance. "You're blushing," he observed one day as she tried to concentrate on the list of musical pieces for the ball's opening ceremony. "It's just warm in here," she replied for the 3rd time that week, resorting to the same unconvincing excuse she had used before. "The academy halls aren't exactly known for being warm at this time of year, Lira," he pointed out with the smirk that invariably made her cheeks burn even hotter. "Perhaps there's another reason for that blush." She shot him a withering glare, though she knew perfectly well that her reaction only confirmed his suspicions and gave him even more pleasure in watching her lose her composure. "Mind your own business, Dean Daren," she said more sharply than usual, desperately trying to restore the familiar balance between them that had been shattered by that ill-advised, but certainly not forgotten, kiss. He only laughed in response, that deep, genuine laugh she had somehow grown to love over the past few weeks, despite all her efforts to convince herself otherwise. It was amid this growing but carefully concealed intimacy that Lira made an unexpected discovery, one that completely changed her understanding of everything that had been happening around the preparations for the ball. During a brief visit home to collect some personal belongings, she found a letter accidentally left in her father's study. It was written in the minister's familiar hand, addressed to Kasha, and carelessly buried among the other official papers on his desk. "Remember our agreement," the note read, and Lira felt her blood run cold as the terrible truth suddenly became clear. "Small difficulties that will slow the preparations without ruining them entirely. Just enough to ensure the wager ends in my favor, nothing more. Your compensation will reflect the service provided." Lira read the note 3 times, feeling anger and hurt gather inside her like storm clouds before a summer downpour. Her own father, the man she loved and respected despite all their disagreements about her future, had been secretly working against her success. She went to confront him immediately, the letter still clenched in a hand trembling with anger. "What does this mean?" she demanded, throwing the note onto his desk, with the same determination she had shown when making their wager several weeks earlier. Minister Valdorf went pale at the sight of his own handwriting. Recognition flashed in his eyes before he could arrange his features into an expression of feigned confusion. "Where did you find this?" he asked, though the question sounded more like an admission of guilt than genuine curiosity. "On your desk, Father," Lira replied, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and deep disappointment. "So all those failures over the past few weeks weren't accidents at all? They were part of your plan?" The minister sank into his chair, looking, to his daughter's surprise, genuinely ashamed. A man caught doing something he himself knew he had little reason to be proud of. "I only wanted a slight advantage in our competition," he tried to explain, though even he seemed unconvinced by his own words. "Nothing serious, my dear. Just a few minor obstacles to remind you how difficult this profession can be." "Minor obstacles?" Lira repeated, her anger breaking through her usual restraint. "Ruined flowers, invitations filled with mistakes, the wrong fabric for the decorations, and you call those minor obstacles, Father?" "I didn't expect them to cause you so much trouble," he said, and the genuine regret in his voice caught her off guard after the initial shock of discovering his betrayal. "I swear, Lira, I only wanted to win our wager fairly, by adding a few difficulties you could overcome on your own. I thought it would prove just how capable you were, even when faced with obstacles." "You hired Kasia to sabotage me," Lira said, feeling tears of hurt threatening to rise in her eyes. "How could you, Father? After everything you said about wanting me to succeed, about believing in my abilities." Minister Valdorf rose from his chair and approached his daughter, genuine remorse replacing the confidence that had accompanied nearly every previous declaration he had ever made about her future. "I do believe in you, Lira," he said quietly. "Perhaps too much. I convinced myself that one additional obstacle couldn't truly harm you, that it would only demonstrate your strength when you overcame it through your own efforts." "You had no right to make that decision for me," Lira replied firmly, though some of her anger was already giving way to a more complicated mixture of hurt and reluctant understanding of her father's motives, however misguided they had been. "This is my dream, Father. My challenge. You violated the very spirit of our wager by interfering." "You're right," he admitted, his shoulders sagging with an uncharacteristic humility. "What I did was wrong, my dear. Forgive me." Lira studied her father for a long moment, considering his words before she finally spoke again. Her voice was calmer now, though the hurt still lingered in every word. "Forgiveness will come with time, Father," she said at last. "But first, I need to deal with Kasia and the consequences of what you've done. The wager remains exactly as we agreed. I'll finish this without anyone interfering again, including you." "Agreed," Minister Valdorf said immediately, his desire to make amends written across his troubled face. "No more interference. I swear it to you, my daughter. Whatever happens from this point forward, you'll handle it entirely on your own, as you should have been allowed to do from the beginning." Lira left her father's study with a heavy heart, but also with a new determination, strengthened by the disappointment she had endured. She would see this through to the end, on her own terms. And she would discover the truth about Kasia. Because now, with her instincts sharpened by betrayal, Lira was increasingly certain that Kasia's motives went far deeper than simple financial interest in the outcome of her father's wager. Chapter 8. When Kasia learned that her role in the string of problems had been exposed, she showed not the slightest sign of remorse. On the contrary, the news that Minister Valdorf had ended their arrangement only strengthened her determination to finish what she had started, on her own, driven now not by financial gain, but by motives far more personal and destructive. For weeks, she had watched the growing closeness between Lira and Daren with mounting fury, carefully concealed behind the professional composure expected of an aerial combat tactics instructor. Every touch, every shared laugh between the dean and the event planner sent another wave of bitter jealousy through her heart. A jealousy born from years of secret, unrequited love for the man whose attention she had dreamed of winning ever since she first arrived at the academy. She struck her first serious blow 2 days after Lira's confrontation with her father. This time, Kasia acted entirely on her own, without the minister's knowledge or approval. Valdorf had withdrawn completely from any further attempts to influence the preparations. Lira discovered the loss the morning before the final rehearsal. It wasn't merely a few missing decorations. The entire shipment of ceremonial fireworks had vanished. The display had been specially commissioned from the finest pyrotechnic masters in the kingdom for the climax of the ball, and included rare dragon sparks capable of forming images of soaring winged creatures across the night sky. "The supplier swears the order was delivered on time," one of the Academy's servants assisting Lira reported, looking almost as alarmed as Lira herself at the scale of the loss. "But there isn't a single trace of the fireworks in the storage room, where they were supposed to remain until the celebration." Lira felt the ground disappear beneath her feet as the full extent of the damage sank in. Less than a week remained before the ball, and replacing an order of this complexity would require time they simply did not have. "This can't be another coincidence," she told Daren, who had been urgently summoned to help deal with the crisis. "This is far too serious to be dismissed as another supplier's mistake." He surveyed the empty storage room with the same grim suspicion that had been growing in his mind throughout the past several weeks, as he watched one inexplicable problem after another plague the preparations. "Kasia," he said quietly. There was a bitterness in the way he spoke her name, revealing his deep disappointment in a colleague whose true motives he had begun to suspect long before Lira had. "My father ended their arrangement," Lira protested, though her own confidence was beginning to weaken beneath the weight of everything that had happened. "He swore he wouldn't interfere again." "Perhaps your father kept his word," Daren agreed, "but that doesn't mean Kasia stopped when he did. She may have reasons of her own for continuing to sabotage you, whether your father approves of it or not." Lira went still. She had instinctively suspected as much over the past few days, but had avoided admitting it openly. She had been too consumed by her father's betrayal to consider that Kasia's motives might run deeper and be far more personal. "What reasons could she possibly have?" Lira asked, although part of her was already beginning to suspect the answer, as previously overlooked details from the past several weeks suddenly resurfaced in her mind. Daren remained silent for a long moment before answering. His expression revealed a mixture of discomfort and belated realization, an awareness that he had failed to notice the feelings of a colleague whose attention he had never encouraged, but had never fully recognized either. Too preoccupied with his own feelings for Lira. "Kasia has had feelings for me for a long time," he finally admitted, speaking with the obvious reluctance of a man forced to discuss an uncomfortable subject. "Feelings I don't return. She's never said anything directly, but Academy gossip has linked our names for years, despite the fact that I've never had any romantic interest in her." At last, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. It wasn't money. it wasn't simply a favor for the minister. It was jealousy. Deeply personal jealousy that had been driving Cassia's actions from the moment she became involved in the preparations. "She sees me as a rival," Lira said slowly, as the full extent of the situation became clear. "Not because of the ball, because of you, Daren." "It certainly looks that way," he agreed grimly. "And I'm afraid the missing fireworks may only be the beginning of what she's capable of if jealousy is truly driving her. We need to take decisive action now to protect everything that remains." They immediately went to the academy rector and filed a formal complaint against Cassia. But they quickly discovered that their evidence was nowhere near sufficient for official disciplinary action. All they had was a chain of suspicious coincidences. When Cassia was summoned to explain herself, she denied any involvement in the disappearance of the fireworks with the confidence of an accomplished liar. Someone long accustomed to hiding her true emotions behind a mask of professional composure. "You have no evidence that I had anything to do with this," she said with icy calm, addressing Daren more than the Council of Deans formally conducting the inquiry. "Only assumptions based on a series of unfortunate coincidences. Perhaps the inexperience of the person organizing an event of this scale is a far more reasonable explanation for what has happened." Beneath the table, Lira clenched her fists, struggling to contain the anger rising inside her at such blatant lies delivered with the absolute confidence of someone certain she could not be punished without direct evidence. "We'll find proof," Lira promised quietly after the meeting ended without resolution. Cassia remained officially innocent, though she had failed to completely hide the triumphant gleam in her eyes when she realized how powerless they were against her carefully constructed denials. "Whatever it takes, Daren, I won't let her destroy everything I've worked for these past few weeks." "We'll find it together," he corrected firmly, taking her hand with a determination that made her heart beat faster, despite everything else weighing on her mind. "You're not alone in this fight anymore, Lira. Whatever Cassia has planned next, in her desperate attempt to tear apart what's growing between us, we'll face it together." Chapter 9. The remaining days before the ball became an exhausting race against time. Lira and Daren worked late into the night, replacing the lost fireworks through alternative suppliers willing to accept a rush order for twice the usual price, while simultaneously doubling their vigilance against any further sabotage from Cassia, whose presence at the academy now felt like a constant invisible threat. "The new supplier swears they'll have everything ready in time," Lira said, studying the contract a courier had delivered that evening. "Though I'm afraid the quality will be considerably more modest than what we originally ordered. The important thing is that the sky won't be completely empty," Daren remarked, leaning over her shoulder to examine the terms of the agreement. "The guests will forgive a less spectacular display far more easily than no fireworks at all during the climax of the celebration." Their closeness had changed over the past few days, strengthened by their shared struggle against the mounting difficulties. Touches had become a natural part of working together, while the glances that had once carried only playful tension now held genuine concern for one another. The real crisis came on the night before the ball. Lira had stayed at the academy late to conduct one final inspection of the main hall, when she noticed a strange, acrid smell coming from the storage room where the decorative materials were kept. "Fire!" she shouted when she saw the first flames licking across the stacked fabrics. The fire had clearly been set deliberately. Traces of a flammable substance had been poured around the materials with the same malicious intent that had characterized every previous act of sabotage. The academy guards responded to her cry immediately, sounding an alarm that brought dozens of students and instructors rushing to contain the flames before they could spread into the neighboring rooms. Daren, awakened by the commotion, reached the scene faster than most of his colleagues, driven by a primal fear for the safety of the woman, whose heart he had been steadily winning over the past several weeks. "Are you hurt?" he demanded when he finally found Lira amid the chaos of the firefighting effort. His face showed genuine fear, completely stripped of his usual teasing confidence. "I'm all right," she assured him, though her hands were trembling from the shock, and her voice sounded weaker than usual. "I got out before the flames spread." Without another word, he pulled her into his arms and held her tightly against his chest, with a desperate tenderness that revealed just how deeply the thought of losing her had shaken him. "If you had been hurt because of this insane jealousy," he began hoarsely, but couldn't finish the sentence, as though the very possibility was too painful to put into words. "I wasn't," Lira repeated softly, pressing closer to him and drawing comfort from the warmth of his embrace after the terror she had just experienced. "Though I'm afraid we'll have to rebuild the decorations for the main hall in whatever time we have left before the celebration begins in the morning." Fortunately, the fire was extinguished before it could cause irreparable damage to the building. But a significant portion of the carefully prepared decorations had been destroyed beyond repair, leaving Lira with an almost impossible task: restore the main hall in the few remaining hours before the first guests arrived. "We're not going to make it," she said, staring at the extent of the destruction with growing despair. For the first time since the preparations had begun, she allowed herself to doubt whether she could actually succeed. "Even if we work without stopping for the rest of the night, it's physically impossible to restore everything the way it was." Despite his own exhaustion from the chaos of the night, Daren took her face gently between his hands with the same determination that always seemed to give her strength when circumstances were at their darkest. "We'll do it," he said firmly. "Not alone, Lira. Together. You and me, the Academy faculty who are ready to help after what happened, and, I suspect, your father as well. I imagine he'll welcome the opportunity to make amends by helping save something that matters this much to you." His words proved prophetic. Less than an hour later, Minister Valdorf, informed of the fire by an urgent messenger, arrived at the Academy in person. He brought an entire staff of servants with him, along with reserved decorative materials from the ministry's own stores. They had originally been intended for far less important state ceremonies, but they were more than suitable for an emergency restoration of the ballroom. "I failed you once, my daughter," he said, removing his formal coat so he could work more comfortably alongside the other volunteers rushing to rebuild the decorations. "Let me make amends by helping you now, when you truly need it." Touched by the sincerity of his remorse, Lira nodded and accepted her father's help with a gratitude that finally erased the last traces of her earlier resentment. There was no time left for anger, only for rebuilding. That night, working side by side with Daren, her father, and dozens of volunteers from among the Academy's instructors and students, Lira finally allowed herself to acknowledge something she had resisted admitting until now. It wasn't only the love growing inside her for the dean, whose determination to protect both her and her dream had overcome every lingering doubt. It was also a profound gratitude for the strange path fate had chosen for her, because this ordeal had revealed the true worth of the people around her, the ones willing to stand beside her and fight for her success, no matter how many obstacles someone else's jealousy tried to place in their way. Chapter 10. The investigation into the fire, launched immediately by the Academy guards, produced undeniable evidence far sooner than Lira had expected. Among the ashes and remains of the burned decorations, the guards discovered a scorched but still recognizable scrap of fabric bearing a distinctive embroidered initial, the kind used on personal items belonging to members of the Dragon Academy faculty. "It's her handkerchief," Daren said, examining the evidence with the grim certainty of a man who had known his colleague for years. "Kasha has carried ones like this, embroidered with her personal monogram, since her first year of teaching." The Council of Deans, which had previously refused to find Kasha guilty due to the lack of direct evidence, could no longer ignore something so significant found at the scene of the fire itself. An emergency meeting was called before dawn, only hours before the official beginning of the ball, in the hope of resolving the situation before the first guests began arriving at the academy. Kasia entered the council chamber with her usual confidence, though it visibly faltered when she saw the burned handkerchief lying on the table before the deans as evidence. "It's merely a coincidence," she began, but for the first time since the investigation had started, her voice trembled, revealing the first crack in the carefully constructed armor of denial she had maintained until now. "Many instructors carry similar handkerchiefs, embroidered according to the Academy's standard design." "The monogram is unique to each member of the faculty, Kasia," Daren said firmly, rising from his seat to address the council directly. "You know that perfectly well, just as everyone in this room does." She fell silent. Her confidence gradually drained from her face beneath the weight of everything that had accumulated against her over the past several weeks. The flowers, the invitations, the fabric, the stolen fireworks, and now the fire that had endangered not only the success of the ball, but the physical safety of everyone inside the academy. "Fine," she said at last, her voice dull and stripped of its former composure. "Yes, it was me. Every setback, every obstacle. I was responsible for all of it." The room fell into stunned silence. Her sudden confession stood in stark contrast to the absolute denial she had maintained until that moment. "Why?" Lira asked. She needed to hear the real reason directly from Kasia herself, rather than continue piecing it together from suspicions and circumstantial evidence. Kasia looked at her for a long moment. There was bitterness in her eyes, jealousy, and the old pain of years spent loving someone who had never loved her in return. A pain finally finding its way into an honest, if painfully overdue, confession. "Because I love him," she said simply, nodding toward Daren without attempting to hide her feelings any longer. "For years I watched him avoid every romantic attachment, devoting himself entirely to his career and his work at the academy. I convinced myself that one day my patience would be rewarded, that eventually he would finally notice me." Her gaze returned to Lira. "Then you appeared, and I watched him change before my eyes, while all the years I spent hoping for the same thing suddenly felt meaningless." "That doesn't excuse what you did," Daren said firmly, though there was a trace of genuine sympathy in his voice for a colleague whose pain he was only now beginning to fully understand, even if he could never accept what she had done because of it. "You endangered people's lives because of your jealousy, Kasia. No matter how deeply you feel, that is unforgivable." Kasia lowered her head, silently acknowledging the truth of his words. She no longer seemed to have the strength to resist the inevitable consequences of her actions. After hearing her full confession, the Council of Deans reached its decision immediately. Kasia was dismissed from her teaching position and permanently barred from the academy grounds. The academy's rules allowed no leniency for such a serious violation of the safety of its students, faculty, and guests. "I'm sorry it came to this," Lira said, as the former instructor was escorted toward the door by the guards. Kasia no longer carried herself with her former arrogance, though the pain in her eyes had not disappeared. "What you did caused a great deal of harm," Lira continued. "But I understand now what was really driving you." Kasia stopped at the doorway and turned back. There was no hostility left in her expression now, only exhaustion and the bitter acceptance of an inevitable defeat. "Take care of him," she said quietly. "He deserves happiness far more than I was ever capable of giving him." Then she disappeared through the doors of the council chamber. Lira stared after her for a long moment, thinking about those unexpected parting words, so completely devoid of the bitterness she had expected. Then she turned to Daren. His face showed a mixture of relief that the ordeal was finally over and genuine concern about the celebration that was now only hours away. "We have a few hours before the first guests arrive," Lira said, glancing at the clock as it mercilessly counted down the remaining time. We need to finish the final preparations before the Academy opens its doors for the most important ball of my career. We'll do it, Daren assured her, taking her hand in his with the same confidence that had given her strength through the most difficult moments of the past several weeks. Together, Lira, just like we faced every other obstacle along the way. Chapter 11. By noon, the Academy's main hall had been transformed so completely that even Lira, exhausted after a sleepless night and the confrontation that had exposed Kasha, stopped in the doorway and stared in amazement at what dozens of people had accomplished by working tirelessly to save the celebration. The restored decorations surpassed even her original vision. Soft lavender draperies, finally delivered in exactly the right shade thanks to Minister Valdorf's personal connections with a trusted fabric supplier, flowed beneath the soaring arches like early spring clouds suspended in eternal flight. The tables, arranged with the dragon's preference for generous personal space in mind, were set with silver tableware that reflected the gentle glow of enchanted lights, carefully adjusted to create the warm, magical atmosphere of twilight. "You did it," Daren said, stopping beside her at the entrance to the transformed hall. His voice held genuine admiration, completely free of his usual teasing irony. Despite every obstacle, despite the fire, despite Kasha's schemes, you created exactly the celebration you dreamed of when this entire crazy adventure began. "We did it," she corrected him, taking his hand with the easy confidence that had grown between them through weeks of facing every challenge side by side. "You, my father, the dozens of volunteers who worked beside me all night, this is our victory, not mine alone." The first guests began arriving an hour later. Carriages bearing the family crests of the kingdom's most influential houses formed a long line outside the Academy's main gates, each new procession seemingly surpassing the last in elegance and the status of its passengers. Lira greeted the guests at the entrance to the main hall, dressed in a flowing gown of soft lavender silk that perfectly complemented the color palette of the celebration. She had chosen it weeks earlier, imagining the moment when she would finally present the results of her work to the kingdom's most distinguished guests. "Exquisite," remarked an elderly duchess of the northern clan, surveying the hall with the obvious approval of someone well accustomed to grand events. "It is rare to see such a thoughtful combination of elegance and consideration for the particular needs of dragon guests." "Thank you for your kind words, Your Grace," Lira replied with a graceful curtsy, feeling pride in what she had accomplished push away the last traces of exhaustion from the sleepless night. "I tried to consider every detail that might make the evening enjoyable for our honored guests." The Dragon King arrived with his entourage closer to evening. He toured the hall with the same approving interest as the other distinguished guests, pausing at each decorative arrangement with the genuine curiosity of a man accustomed to lavish royal celebrations, yet pleasantly surprised by the freshness and thoughtfulness of the event before him. "Who is responsible for this remarkable celebration?" he asked the Academy rector accompanying him, as he examined an elegant arrangement of spring flowers decorating the central table. "Minister Valdorf's daughter, Your Majesty," the rector replied, clearly proud of the Academy's successful event. "A young but exceptionally talented event planner who managed to accomplish all this despite considerable difficulties during the preparations." The king expressed a desire to meet the creator of the celebration personally. Summoned to the royal table, Lira sank into a deep curtsy before the ruler of the kingdom, whose dragon heritage revealed itself in the golden gleam of his eyes, a shade so similar to the one she had already grown to love in Daren's. "Impressive work for someone so young," the king said, regarding her with the same gracious approval he had shown toward the rest of the celebration. "Your father must be very proud to have such a talented daughter." "I hope he is, Your Majesty," Lira replied. She glanced briefly toward Minister Valdorf. He was watching the exchange with unmistakable pride, entirely free of his former doubts about whether his daughter's dream was worthy of being taken seriously. The dancing began at twilight. The orchestra Lira had carefully selected at the very beginning of the preparations played melodies specially arranged for the mixed gathering of the kingdom's noble families. And the first man to approach her was Daren. He extended his hand with the same effortless confidence that had characterized his every movement for as long as she had known him. "May I have the honor of inviting the woman responsible for this magnificent ball to the first dance?" he asked with a slight bow, his eyes glowing with the warmth she had come to love over the past several weeks. "How could I possibly refuse the dean who supervised the preparations on behalf of the academy?" she replied with feigned seriousness, though her heart was beating faster at the anticipation of a moment toward which they had both been moving through weeks of challenges and steadily deepening feelings. They swept into the waltz at the center of the grand hall, beneath the admiring gazes of the assembled guests. Feeling the warmth of his hand at her waist and the reassuring confidence with which he guided her through each turn, Lira allowed herself, for just a moment, to forget every fear and difficulty that had brought them here. She simply surrendered to the triumph of the moment, shared with the man who had become far more to her than a partner in organizing a ball. "Your father is watching us with considerable interest," Daren murmured, nodding toward Minister Waldorf. The minister's expression was a mixture of paternal pride and growing realization as he watched his daughter dance with the young dean of the Dragon Academy. "I suppose he'll have to accept defeat in our wager far more gracefully than he originally expected," Lira replied with a faint smile. "Although I'm afraid the ending to this story may be rather different from the one he planned at the beginning." "Is that so?" Daren asked, raising an eyebrow with the same amused curiosity that had accompanied their banter since childhood. "I thought his great dream was to marry you off to a very distinguished dragon, not some humble faculty dean, even one with a respectable bloodline." "Perhaps fate proved wiser than any father's ambitions," Lira said softly, meeting his eyes with a sincerity that erased the last traces of the defensive sarcasm that had once defined their relationship. "Wouldn't you agree, Dean Daren?" He stopped in the middle of the dance and drew her closer, ignoring the surprised looks of the guests around them at such an open display of affection in the middle of the ballroom. "I would, Lira," he said quietly, leaning closer to her. "And I intend to make certain your father accepts fate's decision with all the enthusiasm it deserves, no matter how unexpected it may be compared to his original plans." Chapter 12. The dance ended to enthusiastic applause from the assembled guests, delighted by such an elegant opening to the celebration. But Lira barely noticed the attention around them, completely absorbed in the warmth of Daren's gaze as he continued holding her closer than strict ballroom etiquette would normally allow. "We need to speak with your father," he said quietly, finally stepping back to a more respectable distance, though his hand remained lightly at her waist even after the dance had ended. "The wager that started this entire story still needs to be officially settled." "I suppose you're right," Lira agreed, scanning the hall for the familiar figure of the minister. At that moment, Minister Waldorf was engaged in animated conversation with a group of honored guests near the head table, clearly enjoying the widespread admiration for his daughter's success. They approached him together. When Waldorf noticed them, he immediately excused himself from the conversation with the same readiness he always showed whenever an important family matter demanded his attention. "Father," Lira began without unnecessary preamble, "I believe it's time to acknowledge the outcome of our wager. The ball has been a success, despite every obstacle, including the ones you originally placed in my way yourself." Minister Waldorf nodded with the expression of a man who had long since accepted his inevitable defeat. Yet his eyes held genuine pride now, replacing the last traces of disappointment over his abandoned plans. You won our wager fairly and deservedly, my daughter, he said solemnly. I withdraw my insistence that you marry a dragon, or anyone else of my choosing. From this moment forward, I fully recognize your right to decide your own future. Thank you, Father, Lira replied with heartfelt relief. It felt as though the weight of years of pressure had finally lifted from her shoulders, after so long spent fighting for the right to determine her own destiny. Although, I must admit, Minister Valdorf added with a sly smile, turning his attention toward Daren, who stood beside his daughter with a protective closeness that had hardly escaped an observant father's notice throughout the evening. I do see a certain irony in the way events have unfolded, my dear. What do you mean, Father? Lira asked, though part of her already suspected where his thoughts were leading. I dreamed of seeing you married to a dragon, the minister continued. And now it appears fate intends to grant me that wish after all, just in a very different way than I originally planned. Daren laughed, his genuine amusement drawing the attention of several nearby guests. I believe Minister Valdorf is hinting at certain ambitions regarding our future together, he said to Lira, the same teasing gleam in his golden eyes that had accompanied their exchanges since childhood. Is that so? Lira asked, pretending surprise, though her heart was already racing in anticipation of the moment toward which weeks of shared struggles and growing intimacy had been leading them. Since I am, Minister Valdorf began, now addressing Daren directly with the formal solemnity traditionally reserved for important family matters, the father of the young woman whose reputation and well-being have long been my responsibility, I believe it would be appropriate to ask what your intentions are toward my daughter, Dean Daren. Heat rushed into Lyra's cheeks at the bluntness of the question, asked in the middle of a ballroom crowded with guests. But instead of showing even the slightest embarrassment, Daren dropped to one knee right where they stood. A fresh wave of surprised murmurs swept through the guests nearby. My intentions, Minister Valdorf, Daren said solemnly, lifting his gaze to a stunned Lira, are to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage, if she herself believes me worthy of that honor. Lira froze. The entire hall seemed to fall silent around them as everyone waited for her answer. Dozens of eyes were fixed on the romantic scene unfolding before them, an unexpected climax to an evening that had originally been intended merely to prove her talent as an event planner, not become the setting for her own declaration of love. Are you certain, Daren? She asked softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Are you really prepared to spend your life with a woman whose first response to nearly every sign of affection from you has always been another sarcastic remark? Those sarcastic remarks, he replied with the warm smile she had grown to love over the past several weeks, are exactly what finally convinced me that you're the only woman capable of being my equal for the rest of my life, Lira. His expression softened. I love you exactly as you are, including that sharp wit of yours, even if I happen to be its favorite target. Tears filled Lyra's eyes at the sincerity of his confession. No longer caring about the strict rules of ballroom etiquette, she pulled him toward her and kissed him, pouring all the tenderness and relief of the moment into it. At last, there were no doubts between them, no unspoken feelings, nothing left to hide. The ballroom erupted in applause. Minister Valdorf, watching with the unmistakable triumph of a man whose original dream had somehow come true in a far better way than he could ever have planned, was the first to congratulate the newly engaged couple with genuine paternal joy. So I am getting a dragon for a son-in-law after all, he said with a satisfied smile, pulling them both into an enthusiastic embrace. Though I admit, I never imagined it would be the academy dean my own daughter has been tormenting since childhood. Fate sometimes takes the most complicated path toward its destination, Father, Lira replied, still holding Daren's hand tightly in hers. But I think the result was worth every step of the journey. The Dragon King, who had become an unexpected witness to the romantic proposal, approached the couple with sincere congratulations, adding his royal blessing to the chorus of delighted reactions from the guests. "A beautiful ending to a beautiful ball," he told Lira with the same gracious warmth he had shown her throughout the evening. "And I suspect that if you choose to establish your event planning agency, young lady, it will earn a reputation not only for creating flawless celebrations, but also for helping its founder create a rather remarkable destiny of her own." Lira smiled at the kind words. In that moment, she realized that both of her greatest dreams were coming true at once. She had proven her talent and earned the right to build the career she had always wanted. And against all her earlier doubts, she had found genuine love with a man who had known her since childhood and still chose her, not because of politics, calculation, or parental pressure, but because his heart had led him to her. The rest of the evening unfolded in an atmosphere of celebration. The dancing continued long past midnight, while the guests discussed not only the flawless ball, but also the unexpected proposal that had quickly become the favorite topic of conversation among the kingdom's assembled nobility. And as Lira danced beneath the spring night sky in Daren's arms, the long-awaited fireworks finally burst overhead, painting the darkness with brilliant silhouettes of soaring dragons. Held close to the man she loved, she felt her heart fill with that rare and complete happiness that comes only when the two dreams you treasure most come true at the same time, intertwining into one beautiful future. Thank you for sharing this story with me. I hope it brought you some warmth and beautiful emotions. What would you have done if you were in Lira's place? Would you have found the courage to admit your feelings for a longtime rival, risking your pride and your usual sharp wit? Or would embarrassment have made you hide those feelings behind yet another sarcastic remark? Share your thoughts in the comments.